I'd like to address today what I think is perhaps, even beyond this election, the most pressing domestic policy crisis in a generation. And it may be the most difficult and thorny domestic issue of my lifetime. But I believe by applying timeless principle to timely action, we can solve this crisis. And I speak this morning of the crisis of illegal immigration in America. But let's also reflect as believers in our obligation to do justice, to stand for law and order and the principles upon which this nation and our Constitution were founded. I must say to you today that bringing all of these issues to bear on immigration reform leads me to the following four principles. First, in our commitment to justice, we must recognize, as President Ronald Reagan said, a nation without borders is not a nation. We must do border security first. In the interest of the integrity of our economy, in the interest of the protection of our families and communities, men and women, we must achieve operational control of our border. And truthfully, given the failure of our government to do this over the past generation, we must insist that it be done first, before any new program is begun. The second principle in defense of justice and our system of laws, I believe we must reject amnesty in any form and reassert the principle that the only way into the United States is by applying outside the United States for the legal right to be here. We must say no to amnesty. But thirdly, and in this order, once we have secured our borders, and they are verifiably secured, and once we have rejected amnesty, then I will say, not without controversy, that I believe we should create a new guest worker program without amnesty and without creating a new massive federal bureaucracy. And we must require participants in this program to learn our native tongue. And finally, I know there are many prosperous men and women in this room, many entrepreneurs and business owners, and so I say this from the heart, but I know it cuts close to home. We must end these four principles with those kinds of measures that will ensure a full partnership between American business and the American government in the defense of our borders and our immigration laws. We must have fines and penalties and an employee enrollment system that brings with it the integrity that our employers require and that our people expect in the American marketplace. Of these principles, I sat down in the past months with many of my colleagues in the House and the Senate, but none more often than Senator Kay Bailey Hutchison of Texas. And she and I managed to build what has come to be known as the Hutchison-Pence Compromise. It builds on these four elements that I just described, and I extol it to your attention. It is a program that puts border security first and exclusively for 2 years. At the end of which, when the President of the United States verifies that border security measures are done, it initiates outside the United States a private sector-based new system of what we call Ellis Island centers, where people in this country or outside this country who have a desire to work in America under the color of the law can go and be processed in an orderly way. A background check, a health screening, confirming their employment. And they are issued a 2-year guest worker visa with their commitment that they will learn our language and obey our laws. It is a proposal that has had some critics, but it's also had its supporters. And I've been very humbled to receive the support of the likes of Chuck Colson, Newt Gingrich, Dick Armey, David Keene of the American Conservative Union, and I extol it to your attention. The President of the United States asked me down to the White House to talk about the proposal. Asked me to come to the Oval Office. I sat in there for an hour with him and the Vice President of the United States. And I got to tell you, for a small town boy from south of Highway 40, that was kind of a knee-knocking experience. The President said he was intrigued with our proposal, with the way that we put border security first, the way that we rejected amnesty, but the way that we found a way, consistent with our laws, to create an orderly system built in the private sector to meet the needs of our economy. And he said, I'm intrigued. Toward the end of our meeting, the President also looked at me and he said, you know, it's an interesting idea, Mike, but he said, you mind if I ask you a personal question? And I said, not a bit. And he said, well, I couldn't help but notice that, you know, Indiana's not exactly a border state. And I said, Mr. President, you don't know how we feel about Kentucky. No, the President said to me, he said, you know, it's not exactly a border state. I mean, why'd you get into this? And I looked at him and I said, well, Mr. President, sitting on one of those yellow couches in the Oval Office, I said, probably October 11th, 1923, probably had a lot to do with it. And he looked back at me like he does and he said, all right, I'll bite. And I said, well, sir, October 11th, 1923 was the day that an unskilled, uneducated 20-year-old named Richard Michael Cawley stepped onto the real Ellis Island from Ireland. And that's how Michael Richard Pence got to the Oval Office to meet with the President of the United States. Then as now, I was caught with emotion, and I looked up to see the leader of the free world with dew in his eyes. And he said to me, you get it, don't you? This is a nation of immigrants. And I said, Mr. President, I don't just get it. I've lived it. And the brogue that Irishman spoke to the day that he died still rings in my ears, and I believe it is the promise of this nation in the future. If we will find a way, consistent with our law and consistent with the compassion of the American people, to solve this crisis and preserve our ideals. And I believe we will. I believe the Hutchison-Pence plan is a place where justice and mercy meet. And there I believe we should close on this proposal this morning. We are commanded in Micah chapter 6, verse 8, to do no less than to do justice, to love kindness, and to walk humbly with our God. We are called to do both simultaneously. And I say with great humility, what Senator Hutchison and I have come across and the ideas that we are advancing, I believe combine those two great pillars of Christian ethic. And I would be honored at your attention to our details. With this I close. We are at a time of great moment in American life. You will hear speakers far more important than me today and far more eloquent. But I will leave you today with a word of challenge. And that is, as Ronald Reagan said in his famous speech of the same title in 1964, I believe we are come to another time for choosing as Americans. With the national legislative elections, the House and the Senate on the line in just a matter of weeks, our nation is approaching a decision that will have historic and global consequences. And I urge your participation and energy and attention and prayers. Now, there are some who look at an increase in spending and erosion of our commitment to values in some quarters of the Republican movement in Washington, D.C. and say, as one commentator did last week, that a little bit of time in the wilderness would be a good thing. That maybe losing the Republican majority would teach us a lesson and get our movement back on track. But let me say emphatically, men and women, that such thinking is nonsense. We do not need more of them. We need more of us. I have been at times a critic of this Republican majority. I have at times criticized our excessive spending habits, the growth of entitlements, the abandonment of federalism. But I must tell you, men and women, that in my 6 years in Congress, I have never, ever gone to the floor on a day when their side didn't bring to the floor legislation that wouldn't have spent a great deal more, intruded a great deal more, broken the back of this nation with debt, abandoned our commitment to freedom in the world, and walked away from the values upon which we depend. We need a Republican majority in Washington, D.C., and I challenge you to labor in the weeks ahead to return it. The challenge of our times is to return to Washington, D.C. in increasing measure men and women who will apply timeless principle to timely action. The intractable problems facing our nation will only be solved at home and abroad by men and women who bring timeless principle and timely action into the well of our national legislature. And I believe we will. Let me close with my confidence. I truly believe that come what may in the days ahead, that since the day that he placed this miracle of democracy on these wilderness shores, we are not living our story as much as we are living his story. And I believe that he who placed this hope of the world on these shores, a hope that drew my family and yours, a hope that fires the imagination of people newly free in Afghanistan and Iraq and those who yearn for freedom around the globe, that he himself will see this experiment in freedom through until her purpose on earth is fulfilled. Thank you very much. God bless you. It has been an honor to address you this fine day.
Pence.